In a quiet, tucked-away corner of the world, there was a man named Harold Jenkins. Harold wasn't famous or flashy. He didn't own fancy cars, wear expensive suits, or jet around the globe. Instead, he lived a simple life, content with what he had. His home was a modest cabin nestled on the edge of Crystal Lake, a place so serene that it felt like something out of a dream. The lake stretched wide and deep, its surface shimmering under the sun during the day and reflecting the stars at night. It was Harold's sanctuary, the one constant in his life. Harold had grown up here, spending every summer swimming in the cool waters, fishing for trout, and exploring the dense woods surrounding the lake. Even as an adult, he never left this place for long. While others moved to big cities chasing careers and opportunities, Harold stayed behind, finding joy in the little things. He loved waking up to the sound of birds chirping, watching deer come down to drink from the lake at dawn, and feeling the gentle breeze ruffle his hair as he paddled his old kayak across the water. To Harold, Crystal Lake wasn't just a body of water, it was part of who he was. But Harold's connection to the lake went deeper than just memories. Years ago, his grandfather had purchased a large portion of the shoreline, seeing potential in the land when no one else did. At the time, it was nothing more than wilderness, untouched and unloved by most people. But Harold's grandfather believed in its beauty and value, and over the years he added to their holdings bit by bit. By the time Harold inherited the property, he owned nearly half of the entire lakefront. It wasn't something he flaunted or even thought about much. It was simply part of his family legacy. For decades, life at Crystal Lake remained peaceful and predictable. The seasons came and went, painting the landscape in vibrant colors before settling back into muted tones. Harold spent his days working odd jobs around town, fixing fences, helping neighbors with repairs, or doing carpentry work, and his evenings relaxing by the fire, reading books or listening to the soft lapping of the water against the shore. He liked his routine. It gave him stability, comfort, and a sense of purpose. And he never wanted anything more. That all changed one summer when a group of developers arrived in town. At first, they were subtle, sending representatives to knock on doors and chat with homeowners about exciting new opportunities. They talked about building luxury homes along the lake, creating a gated community with amenities like tennis courts, swimming pools, and manicured gardens. Some of Harold's neighbors were intrigued, eager to see how these changes might improve their lives. After all, many of them struggled financially, and the promise of higher property values sounded appealing. A homeowners association, HOA, quickly formed, made up of locals who supported the developer's vision. They held meetings, distributed flyers, and tried to convince everyone that development would bring prosperity to the area. New roads would be built, schools would get better funding, and businesses would thrive. For a while, Harold stayed out of it. He attended a few meetings to listen but kept his opinions to himself. Deep down, he felt uneasy about the whole thing. Something about the idea of turning Crystal Lake into a playground for the wealthy rubbed him the wrong way. Still, Harold didn't think too much about it. He figured the developers would focus on the parts of the lake he didn't own, leaving him alone to enjoy his slice of paradise. What he didn't realize was that his land was key to their plans. Without access to the largest stretch of shoreline, their project wouldn't work. They needed Harold's cooperation, not just for practical reasons, but also because his refusal could inspire others to resist. As construction began elsewhere, Harold started noticing changes. Bulldozers carved paths through the forest, tearing down trees that had stood for centuries. Concrete foundations rose where wildflowers used to bloom, and the once quiet mornings were now filled with the rumble of machinery. Harold watched from a distance, shaking his head. He missed the simplicity of the old days when the only sounds were nature's symphony. Now, it felt like the soul of the lake was slowly being stripped away. Despite his growing unease, Harold tried to stay optimistic. Maybe, he thought, the developers would find a way to balance progress with preservation. Maybe they'd respect the natural beauty of the area and create something that benefited everyone. But as time went on, those hopes faded. The HOA grew, bolder, pushing harder for full participation. They sent letters, made phone calls, and even organized events to win over skeptics. Tensions rose among neighbors, dividing those who embraced change from those who feared losing what made Crystal Lake special. Harold found himself caught in the middle. On one side were friends and acquaintances excited about the future, convinced that development would bring prosperity. On the other were a handful of holdouts like him, clinging to the past and dreading what lay ahead. It was a lonely position to be in, but Harold couldn't ignore the nagging voice inside him telling him to stand firm. This wasn't just about money or convenience. It was about protecting something irreplaceable. Little did Harold know, however, that the battle brewing around Crystal Lake was far bigger than anyone imagined. Beneath its sparkling surface lay secrets that would soon turn his quiet life upside down. And when the truth finally came to light, Harold would face a decision that would change everything, for himself, for the lake, and for the generations to come. As the months rolled on, the once quiet town surrounding Crystal Lake began to buzz with activity. Bulldozers rumbled down dirt roads, and the sound of hammers echoed through the trees as construction crews worked tirelessly to transform the area. The developers had wasted no time turning their vision into reality, and soon the first few luxury homes began to rise along the shoreline. These weren't modest cabins like Harold's. They were sprawling estates with glass walls, infinity, pools, and private docks jutting out into the water. To some, they were symbols of progress and prosperity. To others, they felt like intrusions, stark reminders of how much was changing. Harold tried to keep his distance, but it wasn't easy. Everywhere he looked, there were signs of the new world taking shape. Fences went up around properties that used to be open fields. Signs advertising exclusive lakefront living appeared at every turn. Even the air smelled different now, tinged with the sharp scent of freshly cut lumber and asphalt. It was hard not to feel like an outsider in a place he'd called home for so long. One evening, as Harold sat on his porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, two men approached his cabin. They were dressed sharply, their suits crisp and clean despite the dusty road leading to his property. One carried a leather briefcase while the other held a tablet loaded with sleek graphics and renderings. They introduced themselves as representatives from Crystal Haven Resorts, a high-end hospitality company specializing in luxury destinations. Their names were Michael and Ryan, though Harold barely registered them. His attention was fixed on the folder Michael placed on the wooden railing of his porch. "We've been looking forward to meeting you, Mr. Jenkins," Michael said with a warm smile. "You're something of a legend around here." Harold raised an eyebrow. "A legend? For what?" "For owning the best piece of this lake," Ryan chimed in, gesturing toward the water. "Your stretch of shoreline is absolutely breathtaking. We believe it's the heart of what could become one of the most exclusive resorts in the country." Harold frowned. He'd heard rumors about a resort being part of the development plan, but he hadn't paid much attention. Now, sitting face to face with these men, he realized they were serious and determined. Michael opened the folder, revealing glossy images of a grand resort nestled along the edge of Crystal Lake. There were villas with panoramic views, restaurants with outdoor terraces, and even a marina bustling with yachts. It looked nothing like the peaceful retreat Harold cherished. "This is our proposal," Michael continued, tapping the image of the resort. "We want to build right here, on your land. With your permission, of course. This would be a 5-star destination, catering to travelers from all over the world. Imagine private beaches, world-class dining, spa treatments overlooking the water. It would put Crystal Lake on the map." Ryan leaned forward, his tone persuasive. "And think about what this could mean for you, Mr. Jenkins. You'd be part of something truly extraordinary. Not only would you benefit financially, but you'd also help create jobs and opportunities for the entire community." Harold listened silently, his mind racing. On the surface, their pitch sounded impressive, luxurious, exciting, even tempting. But beneath the polished words and flashy pictures, he sensed something else. Greed. These men weren't interested in preserving the beauty of Crystal Lake. They wanted to exploit it. They saw dollar signs where Harold saw memories, potential, profits where he saw peace. "I appreciate the offer," Harold said finally, his voice steady but firm, "but I'm not interested." The smiles on Michael and Ryan's faces faltered slightly, though they quickly recovered. "We understand if you need time to think it over," Michael replied smoothly. "This is a big decision, and we want to make sure you have all the information you need. Let us leave these materials with you and feel free to reach out if you have any questions." Harold nodded politely, though he had no intention of reconsidering. As the men walked away, he glanced at the folder they'd left behind. Its contents stared back at him, a stark contrast to the simplicity of his life. He closed it and set it aside, unwilling to let their vision cloud his own. Over the following weeks, the pressure mounted. Letters arrived almost daily, each one more insistent than the last. Phone calls came at odd hours with voices urging Harold to reconsider. Neighbors who had eagerly embraced the development began knocking on his door, pleading with him to join them. "You're holding everyone back, Harold," one woman told him during a heated conversation. "If you don't sell, the whole project could fall apart." Harold didn't respond. He knew they were right, at least partially. Without his land, the resort couldn't reach its full potential. His shoreline was the centerpiece of Crystal Lake, the most desirable location for guests seeking luxury. But that knowledge only strengthened his resolve. He refused to let greed dictate the future of a place he loved so deeply. Still, the tension weighed heavily on him. The HOA grew increasingly frustrated, their patience wearing thin. Meetings turned into arguments, and arguments sometimes spilled into public confrontations. At one particularly heated gathering, a man accused Harold of being selfish, claiming he cared more about his own interests than the good of the community. Harold stood quietly, letting the accusations wash over him. He knew the truth, that this wasn't about selfishness but about protecting something irreplaceable. Then, one afternoon, Harold received a letter that stopped him cold. It wasn't another sales pitch or a thinly veiled threat. This time, it was official documentation outlining exactly what the developers were offering. Billions of dollars for his lakeside property. The number shocked him, not because he cared about wealth, but because it revealed just how valuable his land truly was. Beneath Crystal Lake lay rare mineral deposits coveted by tech industries worldwide. These minerals made the land exponentially more precious than anyone had anticipated, including Harold himself. Confused and overwhelmed, Harold sought advice from a trusted lawyer named Margaret, who had known his family for years. She reviewed the documents carefully, her expression growing more serious with each page. "Harold," she said finally, "this isn't just about building a resort anymore. These people are after something much bigger. If you fight them, you'll end up in court for years. But if you play your cards right, you could walk away with enough money to secure your future, and maybe even protect the things you care about." Her words lingered in Harold's mind long after their meeting ended. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility of selling. It wasn't about the money. It never had been. But perhaps, he thought, there was a way to use this opportunity to ensure the lake's survival, even if it meant giving up his personal stake in it. As days turned into weeks, Harold wrestled with the decision. He walked along the shore, skipping stones across the water and listening to the gentle lapping of the waves. Memories flooded back. The laughter of childhood summers, the quiet solitude of fishing trips, the simple joy of living in harmony with nature. Could he really say goodbye to all of that? In the end, Harold realized that standing in the way of progress wouldn't stop it altogether. It would only delay the inevitable. What mattered most was finding a way to preserve the spirit of Crystal Lake, even as the world around it changed. And so, with a heavy heart but clear eyes, he decided to negotiate terms with the developers. He wouldn't sell blindly. He would demand protections for the environment, safeguards for local wildlife, and guarantees that the lake's natural beauty would remain intact. It wasn't an easy choice, and Harold knew he would carry the weight of it for the rest of his life. But as he signed the final agreement sealing the deal that would make him a billionaire, he reminded himself of one thing. The lake had always been more than just a piece of land. It was a legacy, and now, it was up to him to protect it even from afar. The revelation that his land was worth billions of dollars hit Harold like a tidal wave. It wasn't just the sheer magnitude of the number. It was the realization that Crystal Lake, the place he had loved and protected for so long, held secrets far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Beneath its shimmering surface lay rare mineral deposits, coveted by industries around the world. These minerals weren't ordinary rocks. They were essential components in cutting-edge technology, used to create everything from advanced batteries to aerospace materials. Suddenly, Harold's quiet lakeside property had transformed into one of the most valuable pieces of real estate on the planet. At first, Harold struggled to wrap his head around it all. He'd spent decades living off the grid, content with simplicity and solitude. Money had never been a priority for him. His greatest wealth had always been the peace and beauty of Crystal Lake. But now, faced with an offer that could change his life forever, he couldn't ignore the gravity of the situation. The developers weren't bluffing. They needed his land to unlock the full potential of their luxury resort project, and without it, their dreams of a five-star destination would crumble. Harold knew he couldn't make this decision alone. He reached out to Margaret, the lawyer, who had advised him before, and together they began poring over the details of the deal. The documents were dense and filled with legal jargon, but Margaret broke them down piece by piece, ensuring Harold understood every clause and contingency. She explained that while the developers were offering an astronomical sum, there were strings attached. If Harold agreed to sell, he would need to relinquish control of his land entirely, allowing them to do as they pleased with it. But Harold wasn't about to let greed dictate the terms. He insisted on adding conditions to the agreement: protections for the environment, safeguards for local wildlife, and guarantees that the natural beauty of Crystal Lake would remain intact. Margaret helped him draft these stipulations, making sure they were ironclad and enforceable. For example, any construction near the shoreline would have to adhere to strict environmental standards, minimizing damage to the ecosystem. Additionally, a portion of the profits from the resort would go toward funding conservation efforts in the area. Negotiations dragged on for weeks, with both sides pushing back and forth. The developers tried to argue against some of Harold's demands, claiming they were too restrictive or costly, but Harold stood firm, refusing to budge unless his conditions were met. "This lake isn't just a commodity," he told them during one particularly tense meeting. "It's a living, breathing part of this community. If you want my land, you'll honor its value, not just in dollars but in its ability to sustain life." Eventually, the developers relented. They may have been driven by profit, but they also recognized the importance of keeping Harold on their side. Without his cooperation, the entire project would collapse, and they couldn't afford to walk away from such a lucrative opportunity. So, reluctantly, they agreed to his terms, signing off on protections for the environment and committing to responsible development practices. As the final paperwork was drawn up, Harold felt a mix of emotions swirling inside him. On one hand, he was relieved. The negotiations were over and he had secured a future where Crystal Lake would be protected, at least to some extent. On the other hand, he couldn't shake the sadness that came with letting go of something so deeply personal. This land had been part of his family for generations, passed down through stories and memories. Now, it belonged to someone else. When the deal finally closed, Harold walked away with more money than he could ever spend in a lifetime. Billions of dollars flowed into accounts set up by Margaret, who guided him through the process of managing his newfound wealth. At first, Harold didn't know what to do with it. He had never cared about luxury cars, designer clothes, or extravagant vacations. His idea of happiness had always been simpler: a cozy cabin, fresh air, and the sound of water lapping against the shore. But as the reality of his situation sank in, Harold began to see possibilities he hadn't considered before. With this kind of money, he could make a difference, not just for himself, but for others. He started small, donating funds to local charities and organizations working to preserve natural habitats. Then, inspired by the impact he saw, he expanded his efforts globally. He founded a nonprofit dedicated to protecting endangered ecosystems, funding research projects and grassroots initiatives aimed at combating climate change. For the first time in his life, Harold felt like he had a purpose bigger than himself. Despite his philanthropic endeavors, Harold couldn't bring himself to stay in the town surrounding Crystal Lake. Watching the transformation unfold firsthand was too painful. The once quiet shoreline was now bustling with activity, as construction crews worked tirelessly to build the resort. Trees were cleared, roads widened, and the gentle hum of nature replaced by the constant drone of machinery. Even though he had secured protections for the environment, seeing the changes up close reminded him of everything he had lost. So Harold decided to leave. Using a fraction of his fortune, he purchased a secluded island estate halfway across the world, a place untouched by development, where he could retreat from the chaos of modern life. The island was lush and green, surrounded by turquoise waters that reminded him of Crystal Lake. Here he found solace, indulging in hobbies he'd never had time for before. He took up painting, capturing the vibrant colors of sunsets on canvas. He learned to sail, gliding across the ocean in a small boat he named after his grandfather. And he spent hours reading books, losing himself in stories that transported him to distant lands. Yet, no matter how far he traveled or how much he immersed himself in his new surroundings, Harold couldn't escape the memories of Crystal Lake. They lingered in the corners of his mind, surfacing whenever he least expected them. He missed the simplicity of his old life, the rhythm of the seasons, the camaraderie of neighbors, the quiet moments spent gazing at the stars reflected on the water. Those memories were bittersweet, reminding him of both the joy he had experienced and the sacrifices he had made. Over time, Harold came to accept that his decision had been necessary. Selling his land hadn't been easy, but it had allowed him to protect the things he cared about most. Through his donations and advocacy work, he was helping to safeguard not just Crystal Lake, but countless other places facing similar threats. In a way, he had traded one form of stewardship for another, using his wealth to fight for the preservation of the natural world he loved. Still, Harold couldn't help wondering what might have been if the developers had never arrived. What if Crystal Lake had remained untouched, a hidden gem known only to those lucky enough to stumble upon it? Would he still be living in his modest cabin, content with the simple pleasures of life? Or would he have grown restless, yearning for something more? These questions haunted him, but they also fueled his determination. Harold realized that while he couldn't turn back time, he could shape the future. His actions, both in negotiating the sale of his land and in using his wealth for good, were proof that even in the face of overwhelming change, individuals could make a difference. And though he might never return to the life he once knew, Harold took comfort in knowing that his legacy would live on. Not in the luxury resort built on his former property, but in the countless lives touched by his efforts to protect the planet. For Harold Jenkins, the journey had been anything but ordinary. From a humble fisherman living by the lake to a billionaire with the power to influence global conservation efforts, his story was one of resilience, sacrifice, and hope. And as he stood on the shores of his island estate, watching the waves crash against the rocks, Harold smiled. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. He had done everything he could to ensure that the spirit of Crystal Lake and the values it represented would endure for generations to come. Harold's new life on the secluded island estate was a world away from the bustling chaos of Crystal Lake. The island was a paradise untouched by time, where nature reigned supreme and human interference was minimal. Towering palm trees swayed in the ocean breeze, their fronds rustling softly like whispers of the past. The turquoise waters sparkled under the sun, inviting him to explore their depths, while white sandy beaches stretched as far as the eye could see. It was beautiful, serene, and everything Harold needed to heal after the whirlwind of events that had upended his life. Yet, despite the tranquility, Harold couldn't completely escape the echoes of his old home. Every morning as he sipped coffee on his porch overlooking the sea, his mind drifted back to Crystal Lake. He thought about the cool mornings when mist hovered over the water, the thrill of catching his first fish of the day, and the quiet evenings spent stargazing by the shore. Those memories were bittersweet, filling him with warmth but also a deep longing for what he'd left behind. No matter how idyllic his new surroundings were, they couldn't replace the connection he'd felt to the lake that had shaped his entire existence. To fill the void, Harold threw himself into hobbies and passions he'd never had time for before. He discovered a love for painting, setting up an easel on the beach and capturing the vibrant hues of sunsets on canvas. Each stroke of the brush seemed to unlock emotions he'd kept buried: joy, sorrow, nostalgia, all swirling together in colors that mirrored the sky above. His paintings became a way to process his feelings, turning abstract thoughts into tangible works of art. Some pieces depicted scenes from Crystal Lake, while others reflected the raw beauty of his island retreat. Painting gave Harold a sense of purpose, something to focus on besides the ache of loss. Sailing became another passion. Harold bought a small wooden boat, which he named Grandpa's Legacy, in honor of his grandfather, who had first purchased the land at Crystal Lake. Teaching himself to navigate the open waters brought a sense of freedom he hadn't experienced in years. There was something magical about being out on the ocean, surrounded by endless blue, with nothing but the sound of waves and the cry of seabirds to keep him company. It reminded him of the days when he'd paddled his kayak across Crystal Lake, feeling like the only person in the world. But perhaps the most fulfilling aspect of Harold's new life was his philanthropy. With billions of dollars at his disposal, he dedicated himself to making a positive impact on the planet. He founded a non-profit organization called Guardians of Earth, aimed at protecting endangered ecosystems and combating climate change. Through this initiative, he funded research projects, supported grassroots movements, and partnered with global organizations to promote sustainable practices. His work took him to remote corners of the globe, where he witnessed firsthand the devastating effects of deforestation, pollution, and habitat destruction. Seeing these struggles reinforced his commitment to preserving the natural world, not just for himself but for future generations. Back at Crystal Lake, however, life had transformed dramatically. The luxury resort promised by Crystal Haven Resorts had become a reality, attracting visitors from all walks of life. Celebrities, entrepreneurs, and wealthy travelers flocked to the five-star destination, eager to experience its opulence. Private villas dotted the shoreline, each boasting panoramic views of the lake. Fine dining restaurants served gourmet meals, crafted by world-renowned chefs, while spas offered indulgent treatments designed to pamper guests. The marina bustled with yachts, their gleaming hulls reflecting the sunlight as they glided across the water. For many residents, the resort brought prosperity. Property values skyrocketed, turning modest homes into valuable assets overnight. Local businesses thrived, catering to the influx of tourists with boutique shops, guided tours, and entertainment options. Jobs were plentiful, and the town's economy flourished in ways no one had imagined. Schools received better funding, roads were paved, and public services improved. To some, it seemed like a dream come true, a testament to the power of progress and innovation. However, not everyone shared this sentiment. For those who had cherished the simplicity of Crystal Lake, the changes felt jarring and unwelcome. The once quiet streets were now crowded with cars, and the gentle hum of nature had been replaced by the constant buzz of activity. Trees that had stood for centuries were gone, replaced by manicured lawns and artificial landscaping. The sense of community that had defined the town began to fade, as neighbors grew divided over whether the benefits outweighed the costs. Some longtime residents tried to adapt, embracing the new opportunities that came with development. Others clung stubbornly to the past, mourning the loss of the peaceful haven they had known. Tension simmered beneath the surface, occasionally boiling over during heated debates at town meetings or casual conversations in coffee shops. Even the HOA, which had championed the project from the start, faced criticism from those who felt betrayed by the rapid transformation. Despite the mixed reactions, there was no denying the success of the resort. Its presence had put Crystal Lake on the map, drawing attention from around the world. Magazine spreads hailed it as a must-visit destination, and social media influencers posted envy-inducing photos of their stays. For outsiders, it was a dream, vacation spot, a perfect blend of luxury and natural beauty. But for those who remembered the lake before the developers arrived, it was hard to reconcile the glamorous image with the humble place they had loved. Harold followed the developments from afar, reading news articles and watching videos online. At times, he felt conflicted about the role he had played in reshaping the area. On one hand, he knew his decision to sell had been necessary, not just for his own well-being, but for the greater good. By securing environmental protections and donating funds to conservation efforts, he had done everything he could to mitigate the damage. On the other hand, he couldn't ignore the pang of guilt that came with knowing his actions had contributed to the loss of something irreplaceable. Every so often, Harold would receive letters or messages from former neighbors, updating him on life at Crystal Lake. Some expressed gratitude for the economic boom, crediting the resort with revitalizing the town. Others lamented the changes, wishing they could turn back time to the days before development. A few even accused Harold of selling out, claiming he had prioritized money over community. These accusations stung, though Harold understood where they were coming from. Change was rarely easy, especially when it happened so quickly and drastically. Still, Harold refused to dwell on negativity. Instead, he focused on the positives, the lives he had touched through his philanthropy, the ecosystems he had helped protect, and the legacy he hoped to leave behind. He reminded himself that while he couldn't control everything, he could continue fighting for the causes he believed in. And if his story inspired others to take action, to stand up for what they valued and use their resources for good, then perhaps it wasn't all in vain. Years passed, and Harold settled into his new rhythm. Life on the island suited him, offering the solitude and simplicity he craved. Yet he remained deeply connected to the wider world, using his wealth and influence to drive meaningful change. Through his nonprofit, he funded initiatives that restored damaged habitats, educated communities about sustainability, and advocated for policies to combat climate change. His work earned him recognition, though he shied away from the spotlight, preferring to let the results speak for themselves. One day, as Harold sat on the beach sketching a rough outline of Crystal Lake from memory, he realized something profound. The essence of a place wasn't tied to its physical form. Crystal Lake lived on, not in the luxury resort that now occupied its shores, but in the memories, values, and lessons it had imparted. It taught him resilience, humility, and the importance of standing up for what he believed in. And while he might never return to the lake itself, its spirit would always be a part of him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Harold smiled. His journey had been unexpected, challenging, and transformative. From a quiet fisherman living by the lake to a billionaire shaping the future of conservation, he had navigated uncharted waters and emerged stronger for it. Whatever lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain. The choices we make define us, and the legacies we leave behind are worth every sacrifice. Years had passed since Harold Jenkins sold his beloved lakeside property and left Crystal Lake behind. The island estate where he now lived was a world away from the bustling resort that had risen on the shores of his former home. Yet as time moved forward, Harold found himself reflecting more and more on the choices he had made and the ripple effects they had created, not just in his own life, but in the lives of others. One crisp morning, as Harold sipped tea on his porch overlooking the ocean, he received an invitation that caught him off guard. It was an elegant card embossed with gold lettering, inviting him to attend the grand reopening gala of Crystal Haven Resort. Apparently, the developers were celebrating a decade of success, marking the occasion with a lavish event for guests, investors, and local dignitaries. At first, Harold hesitated. Returning to Crystal Lake felt like stepping into a chapter of his life he had closed long ago, but curiosity tugged at him. What did the lake look like now? How had it changed over the years? And what would it feel like to stand on land that once belonged to him? After some deliberation, Harold decided to go. He packed lightly, a few clothes, his sketchbook, and a camera, and booked a flight back to the town he had once called home. As the plane descended, he peered out the window, taking in the familiar landscape below. Rolling hills gave way to dense forests, and there, nestled among them, was Crystal Lake. From above, it still sparkled like a gem, though now its edges were lined with buildings instead of trees. Harold's heart tightened, a mix of excitement and apprehension coursing through him. When he arrived, the transformation was undeniable. The quiet dirt roads he remembered had been replaced by smooth asphalt highways, lined with streetlights, and signs directing visitors to the resort. Where modest homes and cabins used to stand, sleek villas and luxury apartments now dominated the skyline. Even the air smelled different, less earthy, more polished. As Harold drove toward the resort, he couldn't help but marvel at how much things had changed. The entrance to Crystal Haven Resort was breathtaking. A towering archway marked the gateway, adorned with flowers and twinkling lights. Beyond it lay manicured gardens, fountains, and pathways leading to various amenities. Guests strolled leisurely, dressed in designer outfits and carrying champagne, flutes. The marina buzzed with activity, yachts bobbing gently in the water. And yet, amidst all the glitz and glamour, Harold noticed subtle nods to the lake's natural beauty. Wooden boardwalks wound through preserved patches of forest, and informational plaques highlighted local wildlife and conservation efforts. These touches reminded him of the conditions he had fought so hard to include in the sale agreement. Harold wandered around, observing the scene with a mix of awe and nostalgia. He recognized certain landmarks, the bend in the shoreline where he used to fish, the cluster of rocks where he'd skipped stones as a child. But they looked different now, framed by luxury accommodations rather than wilderness. Despite the changes, the lake itself remained unchanged, its waters still shimmering under the sun. That gave Harold comfort. No matter how much humans altered the landscape, nature endured. As the evening unfolded, Harold mingled with other guests, many of whom were locals or former neighbors he hadn't seen in years. Some greeted him warmly, thanking him for the role he had played in bringing prosperity to the area. Others were less enthusiastic, expressing regret over the loss of the old Crystal Lake. One woman, whose family had owned a cabin near Harold's, pulled him aside during the festivities. "I miss the way things used to be," she admitted softly. "But I also know we couldn't have stopped this from happening. You did what you had to do." Her words stayed with Harold throughout the night. They echoed his own thoughts, reminding him that progress often came at a cost. He realized that the story of Crystal Lake wasn't black and white. It was a tapestry woven with threads of joy, sorrow, compromise, and resilience. Everyone involved had made sacrifices, whether willingly or reluctantly, and everyone carried scars from the experience. Later that evening, Harold found himself standing alone on a private dock jutting out into the lake. The crowd faded into the background, leaving him with nothing but the sound of water lapping against the wooden pilings. He closed his eyes, letting the cool breeze wash over him. For a moment, it felt like he was back in his old life, fishing, rod in hand, surrounded by the peace and simplicity he had cherished. When he opened his eyes, however, reality came rushing back. This wasn't his lake anymore. It belonged to someone else now. Yet as Harold gazed out across the water, he felt a strange sense of acceptance. Selling his land hadn't erased his connection to Crystal Lake. It had simply transformed it. His memories, values, and love for the place remained intact, living on in the stories he told, the art he created, and the causes he supported. In a way, Harold had become a guardian of Crystal Lake's legacy, ensuring that its spirit endured even as its physical form evolved. The next day, Harold visited the town proper, curious to see how it had adapted to the influx of wealth and tourism. Shops and restaurants lined the main street, their windows displaying handmade crafts and farm-to-table delicacies. Children laughed as they chased each other through a newly built park, while couples sat on benches enjoying coffee and conversation. The town had grown, yes, but it hadn't lost its soul entirely. Beneath the surface glamour, traces of its humble roots remained. Harold spent hours chatting with shopkeepers and residents, listening to their stories. Some spoke of newfound opportunities, the jobs they'd secured, the businesses they'd started, the dreams they'd pursued. Others shared their struggles, lamenting the loss of community and the pressure to keep up with rising costs. Through these conversations, Harold gained a deeper understanding of the complexities of change. Development had brought both blessings and burdens, enriching some lives while challenging others. Before leaving, Harold made one final stop, the edge of the lake where his cabin once stood. The structure was gone now, replaced by a sprawling villa with floor-to-ceiling windows and a private infinity pool. Harold walked along the shore, picking up a smooth stone and turning it over in his hands. He thought about the boy who had skipped stones here decades ago, dreaming of adventures yet to come. He thought about the man who had resisted selling until the very end, clinging to the past even as the future beckoned. With a deep breath, Harold hurled the stone across the water, watching it skip 3, 4, 5 times before sinking beneath the surface. It was a small gesture, but it carried meaning. Letting go didn't mean forgetting. It meant embracing the present while honoring the past. As Harold turned to leave, he smiled. Crystal Lake had shaped him in ways he would never fully understand, teaching him lessons about resilience, sacrifice, and the power of choice. And though he no longer owned a piece of it, its influence would always be a part of him. Back on the island, Harold resumed his routine, painting, sailing, and working tirelessly to protect the planet he loved. His journey had been anything but ordinary, filled with twists and turns that tested his strength and resolve. Yet through it all, he had discovered something profound. True wealth wasn't measured in dollars or property. It was found in the connections we forge, the values we uphold, and the legacies we leave behind. And so Harold continued writing his story, one brushstroke, one wave, one act of kindness at a time. He knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but he faced it with hope, knowing that every choice mattered. Whether protecting fragile ecosystems, inspiring others to care for the earth, or simply cherishing the beauty of a sunset, Harold Jenkins proved that even in the face of unimaginable change, individuals could make a difference. Crystal Lake might have changed forever, but its essence lived on, in Harold's heart, in the memories of those who had known it, and in the countless lives touched by his actions. And perhaps in the end, that was enough.